So when it comes to your podcast, what's the legal side of things? What do you need to put information-wise in your podcast, in the audio, in the show notes? How do you keep yourself legally protected? We're going to talk to everybody's favorite IP and entertainment lawyer right now to talk about the legal side of podcasting.
My name is Tony Iliakostas. I'm an adjunct professor of entertainment law and IP at New York Law School, and I have an Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok account called The IP Professor that is dedicated to all things intellectual property.
Let's talk about podcasts. What do we need to know when it comes to the legal side of podcasting? Do we need to include information inside of the episodes, in the show notes, and what do we need to include, Tony?
So it's all going to depend on, what the content of the subject matter is, I think, first and foremost. So let's use my podcast, for example, shameless plug, NScene, an entertainment law podcast every Friday. So given the nature of that type of podcast, normally, because Evan and I are lawyers and we don't want people to construe what we say as legal advice or for our employers to think that we're speaking on their behalfs, we usually include a disclaimer within the body of the episode. Kind of do a little bit of a rundown. We have a bit of a friendly banter, but then we kick it off to the legal disclaimer. I think it's not necessary for us to then include it in the description. We could if we want to. That said, I think it's enough for us, at least in our opinion, to verbally say it in the podcast, because at that point we know that people are listening, and by the time they get into topics, we've basically kind of laid the groundwork there. So I think that that's one thing that would be worthwhile for anybody if they're in the process of discussing any legal issues or kind of giving an opinion on a legal matter. Making those types of disclaimers is necessary. Also, just bear in mind that it's important to know from a legal perspective that if you're not a lawyer, you shouldn't even be giving legal advice to begin with. So that's another whole different ballgame from an ethics point of view. You always want to be wary of giving away what could be construed as legal advice if you yourself are not a lawyer. That could raise a lot of ethical questions. But beyond that, I think having sort of other legal parameters and protections, squared away in your show description, especially if, let's say, you're sharing certain proprietary information. Obviously, I don't know why you would do that necessarily in a podcast, but the questionable activity. But either way, the show description could be certainly a viable platform for you to kind of at least make other assurances that you need to, especially if you're trying to, make certain representations and warranties about your brand, your podcast, what have you. So I would say that that's the nuts and bolts of it when it comes to providing that legal disclosure.
And we know, of course, for most things, we are going to need a privacy policy as well. Is that something that we're going to store on our website and then just link in the show notes? Do we have to talk about that in the episode, or is it an either or situation?
So I would say that's either or. I know predominantly privacy policies are incorporated on a website, and that's mainly because you have to comply with interstate commerce rules when it comes to data and sharing of data. I know that, for example, California has its own privacy policy notice that has to be disclaimed that may vary from other states. That said, I think it's a matter of what offerings you have related to your podcast. If you have a dedicated website for your podcast, the privacy policy could go there. If you feel that if you don't have a website, but you feel the need to make those necessary disclosures within the show description, by all means, please do that as well. And the show description, or even just the episode description, could be the way to do it. And I mean, I know that usually there are character limits in some of these platforms, so I guess just be mindful of that. I would advocate for maybe even having a short link to a privacy policy, just setting that up as a one-stop shop. Buying a cheap domain and just having it linked there could be a great way to kind of circumvent the whole long description that usually is contained within those privacy policies.
That makes a lot of sense. Now let's talk about making sure we are protecting our podcast. Do we need to have copyright information? What do we need to do to make sure people are not using our podcast improperly or taking pieces of it and using it elsewhere? What does that side look like?
So the great thing about a lot of the podcast upload platforms like Anchor, or I think there's one called library something, Libsyn, I think, or Libsys. There are a lot of podcast platforms out there, but when you create a podcast page that then generates an RSS link, part of the registration includes the copyright notice that is associated with your podcast. So if you were to go onto NScene's podcast page, you would see the C circle sign followed by and Scene and Entertainment Law Podcast, comma 2023, and that indicates that the copyright notice the copyright is attributed to and Scene, aka myself and my co-host Evan, and the year of publication, which is the year that we air our podcast, which is 2023. Obviously, if somebody wanted to contact you, part of the other great thing about working with a platform like Anchor is that you would have to include contact information. So there would be an email that is linked to the podcast itself, and you could easily email someone through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Podcasts, Audible, wherever the podcast can be listened to. But if you want to just add a little bit extra oomph to your show description or to your episode description, I think having those, additional contact us listings would be valuable. So in our case, Evan and I have not just our email for the podcast, but we even have our individual Instagram, TikTok, Twitter pages, so that if people wanted to contact each of us individually, they can do so through those platforms as well. If you want a more formal process, you could obviously indicate, for permission to excerpt from this podcast, contact blah, blah, blah at gmail.com. You could put the email there. So maybe you can make a bit more of a more visual call to action in that format. But certainly that's a very effective way as well of providing a contact page for people to reach out to you if they ever wanted to use your podcast in some manner.
So if we are going to be creating our own podcast, we basically have the choice of either saying it in the commentary of the podcast or listing it in the caption or the show notes linked to that podcast episode. Do you ever foresee a situation where we might need to do it in both just to cover us, or do we think one or the other is going to be enough?
It's a matter of opinion. I'm of the mindset that you could, I think it's relative to each person, but I'm of the opinion that I think it's okay to just do it either verbally or audibly. If you want to do both, I think that doesn't hurt either. You're covering all bases at that point, and I think you're making yourself very clear about a certain stance when it comes to contacts or reuse of an episode, legal disclaimers, what have you. So if you're the type of person that's super conservative and wants to cover all bases, by all means, have at it. I think one or the other is just as viable for sure.
That definitely makes a lot of sense. So if you are going to be creating a podcast and you're uncertain of what you need to do legal-wise in terms of your show notes, your caption, or the commentary in your podcast, and you want to double check, it's always a wise choice to have a conversation with your lawyer about this. They can give you the best information, and they can look at your specific podcast and give you guidelines to operate from there. But as always, if you have more questions for Tony, drop those down below. He's coming back for upcoming episodes. And as always, you can hit him up on his social media and his podcast. So Tony, where can everybody find you?
You can find me on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at The IP Professor, and you can check out Scene and Entertainment Law Podcast. New episodes air every Friday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
If you have questions on this, go ahead and drop those down below. Tony's coming back for upcoming episodes. And every single day, we are dropping videos to help you navigate the world of your social marketing to make this your most profitable year ever as you are building your business, living your best life, but removing the time and stress commitments of marketing so that you can run your business and live your best life. We'll see you in the upcoming episodes.